Hello and welcome to another episode of Father and Joe. I'm Joe Rockey here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, I want to bring up an idea, a notion that I think is contrary to the perception that at least I think I normally have in my head about Jesus and reading him in the Bibles versus some of what the reality of what he did in the moment was and the way that people worked with him or were around him acted. And the general overall perception that comes from his teachings is that basically the Sermon on the Mount, everything's going to be awesome as long as you follow the Beatitudes and follow the commandments. But there are certain moments in the Bible that what other people do around him are literally destructive, but outside the norms that would pretty much upset the standard way of going about life. For example, killing an entire herd of pigs. The guy who is the paraplegic who gets lowered through a roof that they opened up. Now, I know that technology was different then and the materials are different in the desert than they're here, but you're ripping open a roof that was strong enough to have people standing on it. There was some degree of structural strength, a lot of time, probably money and energy that went into building this thing, and people just ripped it apart. And there's no way the owner of that house is happy to see his roof getting ripped up, to have a paraplegic drop down into it. And it's one of the things that actually doesn't get discussed in the Bible. This is one of these things that, kind of separating and thinking back, from that regards, that wasn't nice. Jesus kind of shows up, does this awesome miracle. He has a huge crowd around him and then leaves. At some point he leaves. There's no mention about whether he fixes the roof or he makes the other guys fix the roof. We know he didn't have a lot of money. So it's not like, hey, here's a check, here's an insurance policy. So I use that as an example, but there's many different examples throughout the Bible where there's a physical change, sometimes a demolition in this case. And it's, in my mind, to show that there's bigger things than just the material. But there also is a realistic element of, you just killed my entire herd of pigs. How am I going to make money now? You just put a hole in my roof. How am I going to fix that? Like these are real problems that existed that to an extent were created. And my question is we seem to downplay so much of that in the modern way we view how to be Christians and Catholics, but maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should embrace sometimes you need to rip some stuff down and let the consequences be, and we'll figure them out later. And I bring that up as, I could be completely missing it. I know the danger of taking select passages from any book, let alone the Bible, and trying to form a thought process. I know the dangers of that. So that's part of why I'm talking it out here. But the other part is just to ask a question. Maybe we should be enveloping a little bit more of that into our thought processes and the way that we personally engage the faith with others on a regular basis. So nonetheless, Father, that's a lot of different thoughts I got buzzing around, and I'll let you choose the direction that makes the most sense.
I like it, Joe. Thanks for that reflection. I think, and I like the application too. It's a really nice engagement with Scripture to begin with, that you kind of step out of the biblical narrative and have enough freedom to say, like, that's weird, like that's unexpected. Geez, that's really destructive. I like even the point that you made. I guess I always sort of think of it as like a thatch roof or something, but you're exactly right. It supports human beings standing on it, several of them apparently. So it must have some serious structural integrity, and they ripped it apart to drop him down. So there's something really destructive about that. And as you said, the herd of pigs and those kinds of really engaging the Scriptures with realism is just, again, such a good approach, that you don't just, if you were in a fairy tale well, that stuff happens all the time. Stuff is floating, people are flying. There's like, it has its own kind of physics to fairy tales. But um, anyway, to engage it with the realism of an historical account, which it is really, really good. Uh, you could even say the woman with the alabaster jar who breaks it to pour out all of the nard on the feet of Jesus. Uh, it's a year's wages, right? That's whatever, 50,000, 40,000, $30,000, whatever it is. It's like a huge amount of money, and to take those things seriously at face value is, first of all, just great. And then second of all, the application you're making of like, well, yeah, so is that a model? Is it sometimes, and it's important to say sometimes, it's not every one of Jesus's engagements or miracles or encounters. He's not always destroying stuff or having stuff destroyed around him that he doesn't kind of take responsibility for. But sometimes that's there. And is it sometimes the case that, yeah, you have to, break a few eggs to make an omelet, that you have to lose something in order to gain something, that it's not always pretty, it's broken and messy. And God has a way of making something good out of that. And so we don't have to be afraid of sort of keeping a pristine status quo in order for God to do his work, that in fact, stepping in and letting stuff letting stuff take their relative value. That's really the starting point, is to say, what's more important, a roof or legs, the capacity to walk, being freed from the paralysis of sin and unforgiveness. Clearly, you sacrifice a roof over that. And that's a good message for us in general, that how do we relatively order our values? What does our value hierarchy look like? Where do roofs fit in relation to even strangers, but who are suffering terribly? And we might say, well, it's my roof. I don't, that stranger can deal with his own stuff. Well, that's probably not a gospel hierarchy of values.
Mm-hmm.
We treat human beings as more important than material goods. And we sacrifice even a herd of swine for the sake of freeing one man from the horrors of possession. So those relativizing or ordering of values is really important, and we learn that from the scriptures. And then it's also just it's the logic of sacrifice. It's the logic of investment. We sacrifice the present for the sake of the future. We sacrifice. We invest now for the sake of a greater outcome later. And so we give up the roof for the hope that this man will be cured from it. We give up the herd of swine for the hope that this man will be freed from it. And so the logic of sacrifice is a logic that's uniquely human. Animals don't sacrifice the present for the future, but human beings do. The understanding of time and the understanding of sacrifice track hand in hand. And so ultimately, we're even willing to sacrifice our lives for the sake of love and eternity.
Yeah, and if you look at it, that's one of those things that's definitely easier said than done. Because on the one hand, you just invited. I mean, put this in modern context. You're on a campus, albeit a religious-based campus that probably doesn't have as many wild parties as others might around this country. But think about it. You had someone show up who brought way more people than you thought were going to be coming. And now there's so many people, they're climbing up on the roof. They're presumably drinking on my stuff, because that happens every time a traveler shows up in the Bible. And now they're putting a hole in the roof to drop this guy down. Like, there is no landlord and very few actual people who live in that house that are cool when those events happen. At some point, it's everyone get out. I don't want to deal with this anymore. And I don't think that that's a wrong reaction. I mean, there's even a possibility he didn't even know that was happening there. Not to mention everyone inside being like, whoa, what's happening to the roof up there? Because that's the other part. You just look up and now there's stuff starting to fall on your head because, again, I don't know all the technology. They don't really break into it. But if you're ripping open a roof, I've done enough demo in my life to know there's dust everywhere and it goes in all directions. So that there is no way to say that there is not at minimum the next morning a mess for everyone to clean up. And I also see that people, and probably rightfully and naturally so, are upset by that. Like, I didn't know who these people are. Literally, they took from me and they left me in a worse spot than I was before I was there. So from all accounts of reasonableness, it probably makes sense that you're probably gonna get a little bit upset and all that. So with that being said, everything that you said as far as the value hierarchy of the hierarchy, I also can see in the moment of, I don't care, just stop breaking all my stuff. And not to say that's a reasonable answer or not, but I think it's the way that people, or correct answer or not, but I think it's what people would do. And I guess on the one hand, what you've just given the answer to is the calling that makes that we would say in Catholicism is, that's your cross, deal with it today, as part of that. But there also is a real life in the moment. That's the human reaction. Like, you just gave me a giant problem that I didn't have this morning before you showed up. Like, what? So I said, I might be diving in and looking at this wrong, but this is part of human nature. And whether it was forethought through or not, there is a certain element of deal with it. That's presented as Jesus' next chapter is somewhere else. There isn't. Now, part of it's the Bible doesn't fill in all the in-between gaps, but he's gone. Now you're still here with a broken house, no roof, and who knows what's the next steps are, if he even has the capacity to fix it or whatever. But anyway, those are, like I said, thoughts that I have, because there are moments that we have in our lives that are similar to that in different capacities. So wanted to put that out there as a thought of, in those moments, how do we look to do it? And should we be trying to put moments in other people's lives so they have to rebuild part of their life or relook at what they're valuing? What is the calling there? Because Jesus, like I said, there's no answer about whether he checked in on that guy's feelings after the fact or just basically left in the wind and said, it's your job to figure out what to do next. So I guess that's the question as far as us today. How should we handle that element? That not saying we're putting Hurricane Katrina through everyone, but there's going to be some dissettling.
Yeah, disruption is certainly a key theme throughout the entire scriptures. God is constantly disrupting, because our tendency is to nest in something that is less glorious than we are made for. And we need resting points. We need points of arrival. We need a break at times. We need all of that. And yet we want to nest in those places where it's like good enough, or it's as good as we could imagine ourselves. And we need the disruption that God brings into our lives. We could think of the older brother in the story of the prodigal son. I mean, at some level, he was doing all right. I mean, he was in the fields, he's doing his work, he's living at home, his life was okay, but clearly there was some unresolved stuff that he was carrying around that didn't get resolved, or at least addressed, until his younger brother came back. And then it brought all his stuff out. And that kind of disruption is really healthy. No one wants it, but it's really healthy to have the, things suddenly losing things we thought that we couldn't live without. It's like, well, here I am living without it. I guess I can live without it. And, the prophets are constantly disrupting, and Jesus is by far the greatest disruptor, as he's disrupting the order of the religious authorities. He's disrupting the order of various people's lives. He's doing a lot of that disruption, but again, not just out of a whimsical sense of destructiveness. He's not just trying to cause harm and hurting people for the sake of hurting people. It's always kind of surgical. A surgeon has to cut into somebody. That's destructive, but it's not for the sake of cutting into somebody. It's for the sake of healing. It's for the sake of cutting something out or repairing something that can't be repaired another way. And that's where we can have a hard time trusting Jesus. Is his hurting us, is his disrupting our lives always positive? And that's a faith statement. Yes, I believe. And being able to say that, yes, I believe that God's disruption is always for my greater good. That can be really hard in some of the harder moments of disruption and destruction. So, but that's what he wants to demonstrate in the scriptures. That's what he shows us in the lives of the saints. That's what he's gently led us into personally more and more, is that wherever there is disruption, there is a greater harmony, a greater synthesis that he is bringing about. We're just not there yet.
So again, this is not creating problems for the sake of creating problems. This is, seeing that there's a way to show a better way, for lack of a way to not say the word way 5 times in a sentence, but there is an opportunity to bring some stuff to light, which I guess that example that you gave there with the son who had all this build up tension, you let my brother go, you paid him to go, you gave him all of his stuff now you're just giving it all back like nothing happened. Like, we didn't even talk about that. And how often are there things in our lives that a decision is made? Maybe it's a big decision that has ramifications moving after. How do we deal with this situation? Someone died, someone got sick, someone just up and left, and we just pretended and never really talked about it. We just went back on to our days like that wasn't an event. And how many things are built up within our lives that, this is a big deal. We should at least talk about it or figure something out. But instead, we just go back to, as you said, our nest, our comfort zone, because that's what we did yesterday. And, we'll find solace in that tomorrow, even though there's this buildup of stuff that needs to come out. And, if that's the one takeaway from this episode, to look in a spot in your life where there is something like that, having a conversation that will fix that. On the other hand, as you just said, Father, there's a tremendous amount of faith that things will get turned to the good, even if it involves ripping apart a roof. So we thank everyone for listening, and we will be with you again next week.